Welcome everyone, this is Dr. Mercola, and today I'm here with Dr. Stephanie Seneff, who is a major resource in an area that many of us are not very knowledgeable in, that is sulfur. And Dr. Seneff comes to us through an interesting perspective, which she's going to share in a moment. But initially, you got your degree in electrical engineering and computer science, and really a hardcore scientist from some very prestigious engineering schools like MIT. Many may not realize that I was also interested in engineering when I was in college, and so I researched all the different schools, and clearly MIT, Caltech, Stanford, those are the top of the line, and you've got your degree in there, and then you made this conversion into biological sciences, and really have a passion in sulfur, and you're going to help educate us about that today. But why don't you tell us initially how you made that transition, because it's a little bit of an unusual shift.
It certainly is, and in fact my undergraduate degree at MIT is in biology, with a minor in food and nutrition. So I actually had some good preparation in the undergraduate curriculum that allowed me access to the research literature at this time. And I was, once I started returning to biology, I returned with an absolute passion. And the reason was because, there were personal reasons why I was upset with the way the medical establishment is treating things like cardiovascular disease. And I didn't believe the current dogma. I just did not think it was right, particularly with regard to cholesterol. And so it really came down to, and I always had believed that cholesterol was a very, very important nutrient. Cholesterol is to animals as chlorophyll is to plants. It basically gives us mobility, the ability to move, and it gives us a nervous system, the ability to think. These are two things animals do well and plants don't do at all, and they're crucial to animals. And without cholesterol, we can't do it. So I feel cholesterol, you need to think about cholesterol as a very important nutrient, not to demonize it the way the medical industry has done.
Well, that's a good point. And what I neglected to mention in your introduction is that you eventually developed an affiliation with Weston Price Foundation, and actually are going to be speaking at the November Dallas conference. And
I'm very excited about that. I'm going to be talking all day on a lovely date, 11/11/11. And I really encourage people to come on down because I'm working very hard on these, on my slides for these presentations, and I have a lot to say. I'm very
it's going to be, it's the only conference I'm speaking at all year, and I'm very excited to be there. And
I love them. I think they're so fantastic. And in fact, I went back and read Weston Price's book. Weston Price, of course, lived in the early part of the last century, and an amazing person. He was a dentist, and he went all around the world studying indigenous diets, and his book is just fascinating. And what impressed me was he would describe the things that the indigenous people especially ate. And many of those things were especially high in cholesterol. Things like caviar and, of course, seafood and liver and adrenal glands of the bear. Just incredibly high cholesterol content in these foods that they treasured. And I felt like they were acting appropriately. And here we are today, and America, I think, is the only country that actually has an upper limit on the nutritional requirement for cholesterol.
Yeah, it's just,
which is so insane.
That's the exact word I was thinking of. But you mentioned these dietary sources. My understanding is that about 80 to 90% of the cholesterol in our bodies is actually made by our liver. So it's not really dietary sources.
Well,
so maybe you can help us understand the differentiation or distinction between the dietary cholesterol, which is clearly important in the cholesterol our body makes.
Yes, I can. And in fact, I get very annoyed when I hear this. And we hear it a lot, that your body can make all the cholesterol it needs, and therefore you don't need it in your diet. And while it is true that your body can synthesize cholesterol, it's not an essential nutrient like some other things are. However, foods that contain cholesterol contain a lot of other things that are very, very important to you that are critical nutrients. So cholesterol is associated, for example, with choline, all the fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K, zinc, iron, all these nutrients.
So it's a marker. So may not necessarily need the cholesterol, but you need the other micronutrients that are associated with it.
You absolutely do,
it.
And you need them in association with cholesterol in order for them to be properly digested. So you can't just take a pill, for one of these things. It's not going to work. And the other thing is, your liver can make cholesterol, but it takes a lot of effort. It's a 25, 30-step process, very complex, and you require substrate, of course, and the liver has a lot of functions. And so making cholesterol is just one of the things it does. And if you're eating a high fructose diet, which most people in America are, one of the things the liver is going to have to do is to turn that fructose into fat. And I'm sure you've read them or seen the videos Dr. Lustig.
Yes,
Yes,
Lustig.
Lustig from UC San Francisco.
He's a pediatric endocrinologist.
And I was really, I mean, I was mesmerized. I read, I watched his video. I couldn't stop watching it. And I don't watch that many videos, so I just felt like I'm very delighted when I see someone else who is thinking along the same lines I am and articulating it so well.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fructose goes straight to the liver gets right on the task of converting it to fat, and then it has to store the fat, and it needs cholesterol to store the fat, but it can't make cholesterol while it's processing fructose. I mean, if it's got glucose, in fact, insulin suppresses the fat system. Fat system is basically shut down in the presence of insulin. So when there's high glucose in the blood, the liver is kind of caught in a hard place because it can't make the cholesterol. It needs to store the fat that it's producing from the fructose, and things get behind. And so I think in many cases, people are facing a cholesterol deficiency because they don't have it in the diet, because the liver is working overtime on other things. And then the other problem that's really huge is the cholesterol sulfate, which I don't know if we should switch to that topic at this point.
Well, we'll go into the more basic before we go to cholesterol sulfate, because this is going to be a long, complex discussion. There's so many areas that we want to go into, but just finishing up on the cholesterol issue, the recommended dietary allowances in the United States are about 1,000 milligrams or so.
I don't know the number, actually. I just know there's an upper limit.
There is an upper, well, yes, because you go over it and it's, supposedly you're getting too much. But do you have any recommendations for an optimal amount to take?
I actually think it's hard to get too much, especially in the American diet.
So you almost can't overdose.
Yeah, and eggs are a marvelous food, egg yolk in particular. And it's a crime when people throw away the yolk and make egg white.
Yeah, for my breakfast every day, I throw away the white and have 4 egg yolks.
There you go. So well, that's exactly the thing you should be doing. Egg yolk is an incredible food. It's also quite economical, and I think there's no reason why we should not be eating more eggs. Eggs have, of course, sulfur as well, and as you know, that's our topic. And sulfur.
And sulfur, at least regular chemical sulfur, is yellow.
Yes.
If you know from chemistry, is that one of the reasons why the yellow cover for the egg yolk?
Yeah, I don't know, but I would guess that's quite likely a possibility.
Okay,
yes.
Good. Oh, so you've discussed how you transitioned. Was there any pivotal personal stimulus that caused you to make this transition?
And of course, there was this autism event which happened. I mean, I had we talked about this earlier, I had a best friend at the time, 30 years ago, who had a son who was, he got a DPT shot, and then he had a high fever when he got the shot, and a week later he had a seizure, and then sometime later he was diagnosed with autism. And at the same time, Barbara Lowe Fisher had written this book called DPT, A Shot in the Dark, and so it had come out quite recently, and I read that book through. I had a son who was three years old at the time, ready for his booster shot, and I was worried. I went to the doctor. I said, I don't want the pertussin was the thing. I don't want the pertussin. Just give him the DT, and I was afraid I would have some plaque. And I was very happy that the doctor said, no problem. I know the problem with the P. We're going to leave it out. So he just got the DT shot, and the son of my friend is basically institutionalized. So this cued me into that. But I also knew that cholesterol, from my biology and my nutritional studies as an undergraduate, I knew that cholesterol was incredibly important to the brain. 25% of the cholesterol in the body is in the brain, and the brain has only 2% of the body's weight. So you can see that it's definitely enriched in cholesterol. And the cholesterol is absolutely essential in the brain for neuron transport. So when the brain is deficient in cholesterol, you have a hard time thinking. And I suspected from early on, from 30 years ago, already they were talking about low-fat diet, and I never bought into it. I've never eaten a low-fat diet. I've never bought a low-fat product.
You're one of the rare people, because many experts I know who hold the positions that we do were fooled by that. And I was one of them. I mean, I totally got fooled, and I did low-fat because I was so behind it, but the science supposedly was there. But you're one of the only person I can think of that didn't get caught up in that.
I know. I'm pleased with you can see that at this point when people are starting to question the low-fat diet, I'm ready, because I've always embraced it. And I always ate butter. I never ate margarine. I never drank low-fat milk. I love dairy, and every dairy product I consume is high-fat, including, I think, high-fat yogurt, which is hard to find.
You have to make it yourself.
Yeah, I know. And sour cream, which I love. is a very healthy food because it has both the fat and the lactate. And lactate is also a very, very interesting fuel because it's not sugar, and sugar has a lot of bad issues. And it has a negative charge, lactate. So it's very interesting that it carries its own negative charge. And as we'll get to later, negative charge particles in the blood are very, very important to the blood's colloidal stability. And this, I think, is a crucial thing that's happening to people as they get older. They lose the colloidal stability in the blood, and they start to get into serious problems with blood clots and hemorrhages because of that.
Yeah, so sort of an electron deficiency syndrome.
Yes.
EDS, so we call it.
I like that. That's a very good term.
So how did you make the, what sort of epiphany did you have about sulfur? You know, because you had this interest in...
Yeah, well, so I did, you asked me the question which I didn't really answer. I went to the 30 years ago, but there was also an episode 4 years ago when my husband was diagnosed with cardiovascular disease. And they found a blocked artery, and they put in a stent, and then they put him on a high dose of Lipitor, 80 milligrams, 4 times the normal dosage. His cholesterol level was very good. Before the Lipitor. Yeah. And of course the Lipitor drove it down to ridiculously low values not seen in nature. And of course he also had some side effects, as you might imagine. And I started studying statins. I mean, I started furiously studying everything I could find out about cholesterol statins. I knew it was wrong. I knew this could not be right. And I had to work on him for quite a while, but he did finally, of course his doctor said, you know, you have to take this, 80 milligrams, absolutely no less, very firm about that. So he's facing a doctor who's advising him on the one hand, and then me who's saying the exact opposite. And to his credit, I was writing, you know, articles on the web, and I was doing everything I could to convince him, and he did. He finally decided I was right, the doctor was wrong, and he went off the statins. And of course, all the symptoms went away, and now he's very healthy. 4 years later, he's doing great, and he doesn't take statins. And his cholesterol levels are actually still very good. They're basically where they were, and they've always been fine. It's not high, and it's not the problem. And I don't believe, in fact, that statins are useful for heart disease, period. And I can get into that later, but I have a lot of things to say about statin drugs.
Okay. So were you able to figure out what triggered his heart disease?
Well, so then, of course, I started reading all kinds of things about metabolism and heart disease and all of this. And I identified the problem eventually as a cholesterol deficiency problem, which is extremely ironic.
Interesting. Heart
disease, I think, is a cholesterol deficiency problem, and in particular, a cholesterol sulfate deficiency problem. And the way I figured that out was I was studying how the plaque, the information is actually completely available in the research literature. It's quite remarkable. You have to piece it together. You have to kind of solve the puzzle. But if you read, and I give these people a lot of credit, there's a lot of really wonderful articles that are available on the web from the research journals that describe in detail metabolic processes, that they're understanding the intricacies of what's going on in specific cells and in specific situations. And the story with the plaque is very, very clear to me. I believe I'm right. It would not make sense, really, for the body. I think biology is very intelligent. You know, it has an intelligence that's remarkable. And it would not make sense for the body to simply pile a bunch of crud on an artery that supplies the most crucial organ in the body, which is the heart, block that artery and clobber the heart. It does not make sense to do that. And the mechanism that is cardiovascular disease is actually a factory to produce cholesterol sulfate. And it does this, the macrophages in the plaque take up LDL, the small dense LDL particles that have been damaged by sugar, so that these particles are in the blood and the liver cannot take them back because the receptor can't receive them because they're gummed up with sugar, basically. So they're stuck floating in the bug. Somebody needs to get rid of them. And those macrophages in the plaque do a heroic job in taking that gummed up LDL out of the blood circulation, carefully extracting the cholesterol from it to save it. The cholesterol is important. And then exporting the cholesterol into HDL, HDL-A1 in particular. Macrophages in the plaque do this. So now the cholesterol has been transported into HDL-A1. That's the good guy, right, HDL. The platelets in the plaque take in HDL-A1 cholesterol, and they won't take anything else. The LDL, they can't touch it. HDL-A1 cholesterol, somehow it's like a signature that it's healthy cholesterol. And they take in sulfate, and they produce cholesterol sulfate in the plaque. And the sulfate actually comes from homocysteine. And you know, elevated homocysteine is another risk factor for heart disease.
It was developed by a Harvard physician who figured that out.
Yeah, and homocysteine is a source of sulfate, which also involves ATP. You have to consume energy to produce a sulfate from homocysteine, and the red blood cells actually supply the ATP to the plaque. So everything is there, and the intent is to produce cholesterol sulfate, and it's done in the arteries feeding the heart because it's the heart that needs the cholesterol sulfate. If you don't do it, what you end up with is heart failure.
Okay, so you've done a wonderful job of explaining how important and integral the sulfur is with the cholesterol and heart disease. What other areas have you found sulfur to be important for in human health?
I think one thing I would really like to cover is this idea that I discovered. First of all, I was aware that sulfate was being produced in the skin, and so I was looking at which cells produce cholesterol sulfate. And then I was trying to figure out how does the sulfate get produced. I started studying sulfate, the molecule, and then I was trying to figure out how could the skin produce it. And I had this thought from sulfur metabolizing bacteria, and I wondered whether possibly the human might be able to do something similar to what these bacteria. These bacteria can actually live on sulfur as their source of energy. And I started exploring the skin and looking for molecules that might be able to do something in terms of producing the sulfur. I was really seeking answers, and I finally figured out something really remarkable. I zeroed in on eNOS, the molecule eNOS, endothelial nitric oxide synthase. It was showing up in cells that were producing sulfate, and it gave me a hint that maybe eNOS actually produces sulfate, because red blood cells have eNOS. They have eNOS, and it's not clear why. I read a wonderful article that was, obviously the author was very puzzled. Red blood cells have this thing that produces nitric oxide. Nitric oxide would be a disaster for red blood cells because hemoglobin will bind the nitric oxide, and it'll be sort of like carbon monoxide. It'll prevent the hemoglobin from being able to carry oxygen. So it's a really bad idea for red blood cells to make nitric oxide, yet they clearly have eNOS, which is the supplier of nitric oxide. And then platelets have it, and they also produce cholesterol sulfate. And the mast cells in the blood also have eNOS, and they produce not cholesterol sulfate, but they produce heparin. And heparin is the most negative most negative molecule known to biology, and very, very highly sulfated. So all three of those cell types in the blood that produce sulfate also have eNOS. And then eNOS is, of course, it was named for the endothelial lining of the artery walls. So eNOS is all over the place in the endothelial lining. And eNOS is also in the skin, in the epidermis, the keratinocytes, which are the ones that do the tanning. So it just seemed like eNOS was the right molecule for the job. And then I started looking at how eNOS works, and it was perfect, because eNOS is an interesting molecule. It has a flavin group that actually receives sunlight and emits electrons. It's a sunlight to electron converter, if you will. When it gets shined on by sunlight, it emits electrons. It directs those electrons over here to a heme group, and the heme group has an iron molecule, and the iron molecule attracts oxygen. So you've got oxygen coming in, I think, from the air. In other words, the skin is actually breathing oxygen into this.
It's not just
eNOS.
getting the oxygen from our lungs to the bloodstream.
Yeah, I believe this, and I think this is really such a wonderful idea that I want to believe it.
Passive diffusion.
I mean, you know that dudes can breathe through the skin, so it's not like it can't happen, right? So I think we're doing the same thing, and I have a feeling it's part of why we're hairless as well, because you have more. I suspect you have more access to the sun, and the eNOS, then the electrons shine toward fire at the iron molecule, which has the oxygen attached to it, and it produces superoxide, O2-. And then conveniently, and I just remember how happy I was when I saw this article that talked about this eNOS molecule. There's two of the eNOSes that go together, and they form a cavity between them. And inside that cavity is a zinc molecule, and the zinc molecule is going to create positive charge. So, and again, the authors are like, well, there's this cavity. We have no clue what it's about. It doesn't have any relevance to making nitric oxide, but it must do something, but we don't know what it is. Well, here's what it does. It draws in those superoxides, go into that cavity because of the zinc. And then the zinc also attracts sulfurs, it turns out. And it talked about it in the articles, 4 sulfur molecules that are hooked to cysteines, and the cysteines are highly preserved in the molecular structure of the eNOS molecule. So you've got all the ingredients. You've got the sulfur, you've got the 2 O2-. SO4 - 2 is sulfate. that's the same as SO2 minus O2 minus. So there you are. I mean, I think it's perfect. So I believe, and the other really neat thing is that sulfate is actually, if you break down the sulfate, you will release energy, which means that the sulfate is actually absorbing the energy from light, so that it's a battery. I think of the skin as a battery, producing, or solar panel, you might say, taking in the sun's energy and saving it as in the form of the sulfate molecule, storing the energy in the sun.
Yeah, I've always thought that was true, and I've given the analogy that plants absorb this to get their energy from the sun through that mechanism. Obviously, they use chlorophyll and other components, but I thought that it seemed logical sense that we would have some capacity to absorb energy from the sun directly. But I never heard of a molecular explanation like that. It's just fascinating.
I think it's really a neat idea, and I haven't read it anywhere, but I've read all the pieces that make it make sense. I mean, it just seems perfect to me. That would be the reason why that cavity exists.
Do you think there's significant amounts of energy that are absorbed?
I do, and in fact I did some calculations, and in fact, so I have another, so then you asked what sulfur does, and I have a lot of thoughts about what sulfate does. One thing I'm quite sure of is that cholesterol sulfate is highly protective against bacterial and virus invasions. I think it plays, and that's why sun exposure protects you from infection. It strengthens your immune system. That cholesterol sulfate is incredibly important to immunity. And the sulfate, I read a wonderful article from 1936. This is another one of my epiphanies. I have all these, I mean, it's such a wonderful process. I have to say, the whole thing is very exhilarating when you find these articles. 1936, and these guys did a study of starch, and they were looking for things that would break down starch and different ion combinations. And they tried a bunch of things, and they found that the very best by far was ferrous sulfate, iron sulfate, with some hydrogen peroxide. So you need, again, the oxidation. You know, hydrogen peroxide, ferrous sulfate will break down complex sugars into basic things that they can then be easily degraded and turned into energy. And what this fascinates me with is, I think the sulfate, well, the macrophages, when you see what's going on when they're fighting an infection, because the macrophages are heavily involved in fighting infections, they will, like, so I say, a red blood cell will trap a microbe, and then it will signal, and then the macrophage will actually eat the red blood cell and the microbe. The red blood cell has the iron in the hemoglobin, and the macrophage will then start releasing nitric oxide to kill the bacterium. And then what I think happens, then this heparin goes in there, which is sulfate, tremendous amounts of sulfate and heparin, you know, that gets dumped into the artery wall where the macrophage is trying to take down this invasive animal, microbe. And so the cell of the microbe is these lipopolysaccharides. These are complex sugars. And it's likely that the human doesn't actually have enzymes to break down all the different complicated sugars of all the different species that might come its way. So it needs to have a non-enzymatic method to break down that cell wall. And I think the non-enzymatic method that it uses is ferrous sulfate to break down the sugars in the walls of these invasive species. And our body has its own
supply of ferrous sulfate? Because typically, if one is low in iron, that is considered an inorganic form of supplementation, relatively poor one, because it's potentially toxic if you take it in excess.
I know, iron is very tricky. And in fact, iron toxicity shows up a lot, and I think it's because there's not enough sulfate.
Interesting.
It's not binding to the sulfate. I think the ferrous sulfate mechanism, I think, is designed for this.
So we use it biochemically internally.
Yeah, and we have a safe way
even if we get another source of iron from meat, which is not ferrous sulfate.
Yeah, we can turn it into ferrous sulfate. Okay. Yeah, and I think we do that. I think we do it in the caveoli that are in there's these little cavities that are in the walls of the cell wall, and in the endosome where it fights off the bacteria. There's all this machinery inside the cell where you can contain the iron in a safe place and use it to degrade things like the cell walls of bacteria. Because we don't degrade those things, they're going to cause all kinds of problems, because you're going to have these reactions. You know, you get these reactions to these complex sugars.
From my understanding too, I mean, iron is enormously useful, and many, not most, but certainly many premenopausal women and children or adolescents are deficient.
Yes.
But the problem when you become a postmenopausal woman, or for almost all adult men, is that we tend to have an excess.
Yes,
and then
an excess in wrong places.
Yeah, and then it tends to be counterproductive because it's a potent oxidant stress.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole problem is we can't store it properly, and I suspect that has to do with things like cholesterol deficiency in the cell. But I still need to do some more research to figure out the details there.
the actual levels, like reflected by ferritin levels, may be elevated because of sulfur deficiency?
Yeah, well, sulfur deficiency, and that's right, sulfur deficiency, sulfate deficiency, and cholesterol deficiency. Because I think you need these. So these caveoli, I mentioned the caveoli very briefly, but they are these very interesting little caves that go. The caveoli means caves, that are surrounded in various spots around the cell wall, and they are sort of contained regions where I think reactions can take place safely. It's sort of like a fireplace. I think of it as a fireplace, and I think this ferrous sulfate actually breaks down, helps to break down sugar and keep the sugar from being toxic in these caveoli. And so if you don't have enough...
Are these sugar polymers or single monosaccharides?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, I have, again, I'm getting into sort of bold territory and some speculative ideas. But because I'm quite fascinated by the fact that ferrous sulfate is a very potent
it makes sense
molecule for breaking down sugars.
Non-specific, non-enzymatic way to...
Yeah, non-enzymatic, which is crucial for all these external organisms that we don't understand how to, we don't have the enzymes to break them down. And they'll become toxic. We'll get these sort of immune reactions if we don't clean them out, you know, if you can't clean them out.
Sure.
So I think that's a crucial thing. And then the sulfate also is absolutely crucial, as I said, for the negative charge. And all the red blood cells have a negative charge around them, which makes them repel each other. And so if they didn't have the negative charge, they'd glom together.
And it's called rouleau. When you see them under a microscope, or
yes,
stack
it's beautiful,
of red
isn't
blood
it?
cells. Well, it's a bad thing to have, but when you see it, it's a sign of problems. Either most likely some type of electron deficiency, which could be an artifact of sulfur deficiency.
That's what I think, because I think sulfate is an incredibly super molecule for giving you the negative charge. And then you have all the cells in the body have these extracellular matrix proteins. They have lots of complicated names, but they are basically fats and sugars, complex sugars, and sulfate. And the sulfate part is very, very important. I think it gets depleted as you age because of this inadequate supply of cholesterol sulfate. And eventually you have to start getting sulfur from wherever you can get it. And one of the places you can get it from is the collagen that's in your joints. Collagen is highly has all these sulfur disulfide bonds that give it its strength. So if you start stealing sulfur from collagen,
sulfate.
Yeah, chondroitin sulfate, that's right. Chondroitin sulfate, heparin sulfate, keratin sulfate, all of those sulfated proteoglycans are in this extracellular matrix. And it's actually fun. I think it's just like the glial cells in the brain. I remember reading a long time ago, first reading about the glial cells and how they were just like cushion, you know? And then I said, no, that can't be true. It's got to be more important than that. And it turns out that they're absolutely essential for all kinds of things in the brain. And then I think the same thing is true of these extracellular matrix proteins, that people aren't really paying a lot of attention to them, but they actually have a very, very important role in keeping the cell healthy.
And when these proteins are damaged or deficient in sulfur and they start to diminish, then one of the side effects, my understanding, is that you can lead to arthritis.
That's right, and that's because I think that's because you're depleting your collagen from your joints, and that's what's causing the arthritis.
To supply the sulfur.
Yeah, to supply the sulfur, and then the collagen, because it is in fact degrading the collagen. That's what's happening when you look at the arthritis, and it's degrading it to get at the sulfur, I suspect.
And is this a reversible process?
I would hope so. I mean, I would certainly, if I had arthritis, I would be spending a lot of time soaking in hot springs. You know, they have these sulfur hot springs.
Sure.
And you can get the magnesium sulfate. I recommend that as a source of just
so
sulfate.
It's possible to absorb this passively through the skin?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
So I think that's a good therapy to help. And of course, so that when you get when you make the sulfate in the skin, it's possible that you're even bringing the sulfur in from the air, which I find also a wonderful idea. Oxygen is in the air, and also hydrogen sulfide. And so when your skin is making sulfate, it could be that it's getting the sulfur from the air.
Interesting.
So that, and then this also makes an interesting point that the Clean Air Act, which has removed sulfur from the air, is working against that. So that the air is depleted in sulfur, and also water, filtering water removes the sulfur from the water. So we're conspiring to reduce our sulfur supply.
My personal supply of water is from a well, so I don't have a municipal water supply, and we clearly have some sulfur-containing bacteria in the well, so it produces hydrogen sulfate, which is the rotten egg smell.
Yes.
And it becomes somewhat offensive, so the typical strategy is to chlorinate the well or use some type of chlorine injection system to remove the hydrogen sulfate. And I'm wondering if you can comment on the wisdom of that and if there's a benefit to drinking hydrogen sulfide in the water from the bacteria.
Yeah, well, see, I think you basically, hydrogen sulfide, you're basically going to lose it because it's a gas. It's just going to disappear.
So you're not going to...
You need it as fixated as a sulfate or something.
Okay, so you're not going to get any from the water slide, even though it's in there.
Yeah, once it's hydrogen sulfide, you're stuck.
Okay.
And I think, in fact, the filtration process produces hydrogen sulfide and extracts the sulfate, therefore, from. It loses the sulfate in the filtering and ends up removing the sulfur. Okay. And, in fact, hard water is... it's very clear that people who drink hard water have, on average, a decreased risk to cardiovascular disease compared to people who drink soft water. And it's something people haven't been able to figure out why. And I think
do you have any speculations?
I think it's the sulfur.
Oh.
The softening process removes the sulfur.
Oh, okay.
So you get sulfur. You can get sulfur from water. You can get it from air, potentially, through the hydrogen sulfide that comes in and gets fixated in the sulfate. You can get it from vegetables. The sulfate, you know, if the vegetables are grown in soil that contains adequate sulfate. I think that sulfur is overlooked in, there are modern farming methods tend to remove the sulfur from the soil. And then we put in all these nitrates
with commercial
and phosphates.
agriculture.
Yeah,
organic farming
organic
practices would tend to increase it.
Organic is great.
But what are the, if obviously the normal strategy is to use a food-based approach rather than taking a supplemental form. But so if one was compelled of the evidence and the research and literature that you're reviewing of the importance of sulfur and improving it in our system, what's the best way to increase sulfur?
I believe the best way is eggs and meat and seafood.
Eggs and meat and seafood.
So it's basically...
And what type of quantities are we looking at?
I believe in eating a lot. So actually, I have adjusted my diet in the last few years, ever since my husband had his cardiovascular issues, towards less and less. I already was very happy to eat fats and cholesterol, but I've been conscientiously avoiding carbs in the last few years, particularly, of course, empty carbs, flour, sugar, noodles, you know, pasta, rice. Basically, eliminate those from your diet, and I feel that's a very important thing to do, to keep down the carbs.
Does that have an influence with the sulfur, though?
Yeah, I'm trying to. I know you asked me that question, and how do I answer that? I
mean, they're important for a number of reasons that we can go on for long periods of time to the importance of lowering your carbs in general.
Well, having inadequate sulfur actually, I think, leads to an inability to bring sugar in to the muscle cells.
Okay.
And
because there's a connection with sulfur and diabetes.
Yeah. So if you don't have enough sulfur, you can't process the sugars in the muscle cells. And this gets into the whole issue of the fat cells playing a role in converting the sugar to fat in order to supply the muscle cells with fat, which is another thing that I believe. And so I think a reason why you get fat is because the muscle cells can't handle sugar, and the fat cells have to play this role of translating the sugar into fat. Now, you asked me a question. I don't think I answered it.
Well, just trying to get a perspective, the quantity-wise, because you had mentioned that.
Well, that's why I was saying, yeah, eat a lot. So by virtue of cutting down the carbs, you end up increasing those foods that contain sulfur. And so I try to eat a lot of high protein, high fat foods, and also animal products, and high saturated fat, as opposed to unsaturated fat. So saturated fats are considered unhealthy, and again, I think that's incorrect. And of course, coconut oil is a vegetable fat that's also very, very healthy.
But there's not much sulfur in coconut oil, is there?
Coconut has sulfur.
Oh, it does?
Yes.
That is surprising.
And olive oil has sulfur, too.
Interesting.
But another interesting thing is that the Mediterranean diet, for example, which is very popular and probably quite healthy, but I believe the Mediterranean diet only really works in the Mediterranean.
No, because of the soil?
Yeah, the sulfur.
The foods are grown.
The Mediterranean actually has a lot of sulfur. It's interesting. Greece and Italy are major world suppliers of sulfur. And they also have very low cardiovascular disease.
Interesting.
And it's very interesting in Greece. There are these two islands. One is Crete and one is Koptos. And Crete is in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, and it sits on top of the ridge crest, and the ridge crest has all this basalt rock. And basalt is a very good source of sulfur. And Koptos is the top of a limestone mountain, so it's all limestone. And Crete and Koptos have very similar climate, very similar diet, and Koptos has 5 times the risk of heart disease compared to Crete.
Yeah, it's pretty strong epidemiological support for your hypothesis.
Sulfur, And Iceland has very, very low. Iceland is a very healthy place to live. I think you know that.
Sure.
Very, very low infant mortality, under 5 mortality, very, very low cardiovascular disease. I mean, they have a lot of good things, and tons of sulfur because they've got that, they're on the top of the ridge crest of the mid-Atlantic Ocean. So it's a healthy place to be on the top of an island that is a ridge crest of an ocean, because then you're going to get a lot of basalt rock. Also, for example, in the U.S., the lowest obesity rates among children is in Oregon. And Oregon has that whole Cascade Mountain chain that's all basalt rock. So that's another indicator. So I feel like there's pretty strong correlations between
Well, I want to
sulfur.
get back to the obesity link, but I still want to finish up the quantity of sulfur. So how many, just to get an idea, so generally higher amounts of animal fats and proteins, and for eggs, if someone wasn't going to, for whatever reason, chose to minimize their meat intake, what number of eggs would you suggest?
Oh, I don't think there's an upper limit. I think eggs are
how about a
very
minimum
healthy.
limit?
Yeah.
Or minimum level?
Well, I guess 1 a day would be encouraged. Yeah.
But what is sort of a window, a range that would be to shoot for?
Yeah.
I mean, 6, 10, 12,
I mean,
4?
Yeah, I don't eat lots and lots of eggs. I try to eat seafood, actually. I think
are eggs a higher source than meats?
So one of the problems is that sulfur doesn't have a minimum daily requirement,
Okay.
which is shocking to me. And as a consequence, it's very hard to find out which foods contain it. I'm very frustrated by that. I'm guessing because of cysteine. So sulfur is contained in the sulfur,
amino acids, right?
Yeah,
Is
the
that where it's
sulfur containing amino acids are essential amino acids, cysteine and methionine. And those are more heavily populated in animal products than in plants. So I think that those are a very good source of sulfur than is meat and seafood. I think actually oysters are a fabulous food. They contain cholesterol, sulfur, zinc. They have lots of zinc. And zinc is important because, remember, it's in the cavity. So I think a zinc deficiency may also be playing a role.
So this would lead one to believe that someone choosing a vegetarian or a vegan, even worse, a vegan dietary choice, for whatever reason, may be at risk for developing a severe sulfur deficiency, since most of these are animal-based sources.
I would absolutely agree with you. I think I'm quite disturbed by this kind of veganism that seems to be catching on right now, and I think it's definitely a very bad choice.
So if someone chose to do that, it's certainly excluding animal products. Well, I guess there's different versions of vegetarianism, and certainly one could include eggs as part of that, and fish. So that would be sort of the next step up, at least to have some eggs and fish to prevent that.
I think seafood is incredibly healthy. In fact, there's a theory that humans evolved on the seashore, and I think it has a lot of merit. Elaine Morgan was a woman in Britain. She's been writing books every 10 years that advocate this notion of the seafood the seashore origin of the human species, which I find really fascinating. And I suspect that she's right. And you see a lot of course, early man on the seashore with his shells and everything.
And the omega-3 fats in the brain.
Yeah, so I think that actually if you look back at our original diet, or at least the diet when we became human, I suspect that it was extremely high in seafood. And clams, oysters, crabs, lobsters, and seaweed itself is also very healthy as a plant. So I think that if you could do that kind of a diet, I think it would be probably very healthy.
Now, for those of us who may not be able to consume as much sulfur, and it sounds like it's even really difficult to identify the sulfur in a diet, because it hasn't been really well quantified. So if we wanted to give another boost, I mean, the basic premise is that it's almost always better to get nutrients from food, whole foods, unprocessed
yes, I agree
foods.
With
I
that.
mean, that's the basis. But say for someone's for ethical or spiritual reasons is choosing a vegan lifestyle, and they still are convinced of the benefits of sulfur. Are there any supplemental forms that you have found to be useful, or are we entering into the same realm and dilemma that you referenced earlier with vitamin D, where well, vitamin D is great, there's research to support it, but it's only when you get it naturally that it seems to be the benefit. When you take it orally, it's maybe not so beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, I don't take oral supplements for sulfur. I guess there is chondroitin sulfate, which perhaps, because of the sulfate, and I look for things that have sulfur in them. And chondroitin sulfate could be a possibility, but I don't know. I haven't taken it, and I probably wouldn't take it. I think soaking in magnesium sulfate.
So magnesium sulfate would be one that you
Epsom
can
salt.
soak in.
So that's actually you simulate a sulfur hot springs by just buying a big carton of Epsom salts, throwing some in the water.
Is it a pound, 2 pounds, 10 pounds? How much would you do?
Um,
And how long would you stay
So
in the
I
room?
actually do use Epsom salts. It's like the only thing I use besides just natural foods. And I just sprinkle a little actually in the bath, maybe a couple times a week type of thing,
So,
and just soak in it in a hot
is it
bath.
a few tablespoons, a few
it's
ounces?
probably about a quarter of a cup, maybe.
Quarter of a cup?
Yeah.
So a few ounces.
Which is less than what they, like if you're going to, because you can use it to treat like aching muscles
Sure,
or something. And so I don't know what that is, but it's more than that. So I use less than what they
And
tell
use
you
it
on the box.
daily basis or
Twice a week.
twice a week?
Yeah.
So
And hot water and soak in it.
So the recommendation to use Epsom salts in a tub for arthritis pain, most likely is beneficial for the
Arthritis is
sulfur.
exactly right, because it's resupplying the sulfur, which then means you don't have to get the sulfur out of the joints, the collagen. So I think it's completely obvious why it would protect you from arthritis.
That's your best recommendation, supplemental. So because there's other forms like
this is MSM, and I
MSM.
don't know. I mean, this is what, we talked about that earlier, but I don't know.
Okay, so it may be benefit, you just haven't studied it.
Yeah, I don't know how to find out either, which is a little bit frustrating. I mean, you could be a guinea pig and try it. It might,
Wow. Because there seems to be some compelling, certainly a lot of people promote it, and they wouldn't promote it without some basis. And I'm wondering, have you looked at their reasons that they're recommending it and just not found that the science is
I
there?
have not done the proper study because
Okay.
I tend to avoid.
Avoid supplements.
Yeah.
Okay. So
but you should actually look into it, because I think if you could determine scientifically, be convinced, I think then it would be very compelling, because certainly we need sulfur, and I think our whole modern lifestyle has kind of conspired against it. And then of course there's nobody advocating sulfur in the,
well, certainly
government or
it's in a minority. There's very few people. The closest would be those who recommend MSM. For sulfur, but one of the.
I mean the government, the
there's no
experts,
there's no conventional health experts. There's none.
Yeah.
It's just some of the people in the natural health world. So one of the other benefits of sulfur sufficiency was relative resistance to obesity, and that doesn't seem an obvious connection. So I'm wondering if you can explain.
That's this thing I explained about the sugar, because I think that if you don't have enough sulfur, you don't get enough cholesterol in your cell walls, you don't have enough of these caveoli, and the caveoli are where the sugar comes in. The sugar only comes in through the caveoli into the cell. And then, so the insulin-based sugar transport into the cell is derailed if there isn't enough cholesterol, which is because there isn't enough sulfur.
It's fascinating.
And then the muscle cell has to revert to using fat. And that's why the fat cell has to convert the sugar into fat and store it as fat so that it can fuel the muscle cell. I think that's the whole story with that. And I think that fat cells also store toxins, because there's various toxins that you can't get rid of, and sulfur is actually very, very important for getting rid of toxins. And this gets into actually vaccines, because one of the toxins in vaccines that I think is a very serious problem is aluminum. And aluminum sulfate is aluminum sulfate is a molecule that's used in chemistry to precipitate proteins out.
Is it an adjuvant too? Is that why they use it?
Aluminum is an adjuvant in the vaccine, and it's an adjuvant because, and I guess you probably know all about the vaccine situation. I've just been getting on board with vaccines, and I've done a lot of studying of vaccines in the last few months, and I'm deeply disturbed by what I'm seeing. And they add the aluminum in order to get the child to react enough, because if the child has a strong immune system, and you just give them a vaccine of some dead microbe, the body's just going to slough it off. It's like, okay, this is no big deal. I'm not going to even bother. And they won't develop a memory, and they won't actually be resistant to the disease. So they have to put something else in the vaccine to make you react more. And they've discovered that aluminum works really well for that purpose. And they've been increasing the amount of aluminum that shows up in vaccines quite systematically over the last 20 years, particularly over the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And of course, also they've been increasing the number of vaccines that the children receive as well.
Well, and there are a number of experts who believe the aluminum is actually far more dangerous than the mercury, which is in the form
absolutely the case.
I believe it's ethyl mercury, which is far more toxic than methyl mercury. That uses thimerosal.
Thimerosal, I know.
As
and
a preservative.
I got totally into this. And in fact, now you remember that I did this study of all the statin drug side effects. Turns out the U.S. government provides you with a very wonderful database, which is all the vaccine adverse reactions. There's a database called VAERS.
The VAERS database, sure.
Yes, Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. And it's wonderful. I got the whole set. It's like 330,000.
It's open to the public. Anyone can use it.
It's terrific. 330,000 records. So I have been doing the same thing with the vaccines that I did with the statins earlier, and I am finding out extraordinary things. So I started off, of course, autism. I mean, autism and vaccines is a huge controversial issue right now. And there's this horrible story about Wakefield and how people thought, you know, the Wakefield story where he published the paper in Lancet about the kids who had autism, and then said that it was due to the vaccine was contributing, and then he was accused of fraud. His paper was withdrawn. His credentials were removed. He had to leave England. I mean, it was a mess. And of course, the whole world found out. They made sure everybody knew about this event. And the message that got out was there is no relationship between autism and vaccines. Forget it. Get over it. It's done. And of course, the autism community will not give up. And then people think, well, they're just so foolish. They just won't give up, you know. And the fact is they are on to something. It is very clear to me. And it's really sad what happened, because when you look at the statistics, so I've been looking at everything, first starting with autism and then moving on to aluminum, which was a natural progression, because I looked at the autism and I just said, well, let me just see how many cases mention the word autism somewhere in the report over time, starting 1990, 2010. And what you see is astonishing. There's like this kind of very low level. 2000, it skyrockets, and then it kind of bumbles around, but it's high the whole rest of the time. 14 times as many count after 2000 as before 2000 of autism mentioned in the report. So something happened at 2000. So then I started searching the web to figure out what might have happened at 2000, and I found that in 1999 they removed the thimerosal, because they said, you know, you know what, it's not the mercury, but
the CDC and the EPA got involved with it.
They said, well, if you guys think it's a mercury, fine, we'll get rid of the mercury just to appease you, you know?
Even though they didn't in a number of, and it's still
I know,
today.
they've been bringing it back in.
Today is in the flu vaccines, except for the inhaled ones.
I know, they've been bringing it back in. I suspect they're bringing it back in because they know the aluminum is worse.
Right.
But they don't want to tell us that. This is what I think. So then
they substitute the aluminum for the thimerosal.
Yeah.
Because it's also preservative?
Yeah,
it
also does, I think that, you know, it's confusing, because I've read a lot of stuff, and they did, in fact, put in more aluminum. That's very clear.
In around 2000.
At the same time as they removed the mercury. Now, exactly why they did that, I don't know, and whether the mercury is also an adjuvant. The aluminum is definitely an adjuvant, and the mercury is well, the other thing that might have happened, this is a very interesting idea, they put it into individual glass vials because they couldn't have the big pile because they didn't have the mercury in there. And glass, and especially the rubber stopper, have aluminum in them, and if it's stored in the glass vial, it can leach the aluminum out of the rubber stopper and out of the glass. So it's possible that it got even contaminated with aluminum through that process. This actually happens. There's a real problem with aluminum contamination in dialysis fluids that causes dementia. I don't know if you know about all of that, but it's very, very clear.
Aluminum binders to prevent that.
It's very, very clear the aluminum is causing the dementia in the case of the Alzheimer, of the dialysis. And dementia has something in common with autism, I think. So anyway, the aluminum. So the aluminum. So then I did I looked at the symptoms before 2000, after 2000, and I looked to see which symptoms were much more common after 2000. And there were several, and they were scary. Things like seizure, high fever, death, you know, and fatigue and depression, and a bunch of things that were more common after 2000. So then I could find out from the web which vaccines actually contain aluminum, which ones don't. So I did another cut on the data, for all the data, the ones that contain aluminum, the ones that don't contain aluminum. And I did the same thing, look at the symptoms. And there's a set of 13 symptoms that show up extremely probably in the contain aluminum camp and in the after 2000 camp. In other words, there's a set of symptoms that are highly correlated with both after 2000 and containing aluminum, which implies that the difference is the aluminum in the before and after 2000. So I think that the aluminum, and then the other problem is aluminum binds with sulfate. Sulfate is needed to remove aluminum from the body. And autistic kids, so I started studying sulfate in autistic kids, and it's very clear that they are deficient in sulfur in a major way. They have only 1/3 as much free sulfate in the blood as normal kids. And sulfate is needed. It binds to the aluminum and it exports it from the body. So if you don't have enough sulfate, you can't afford to do that, because if you get rid of too much sulfur, your blood will coagulate. You will be in deep trouble. or you'll hemorrhage, one or the other. I mean, you're basically caught in a very difficult situation when you don't have a healthy colloidal suspension because you don't have enough negative charge around all the cells.
Sure.
So you can't afford to deplete the sulfate, so instead the aluminum accumulates in the brain. And I think, and in the brain it causes severe problems, as is seen with dialysis.
At the last National Vaccine Information Center conference, which was I believe about 2 years ago in Washington, D.C., they had a presenter there, Dr. David Ayub, A-Y-O-U-B, I believe is his name, and I actually interviewed him, and his whole presentation was on the toxicity of aluminum and how it relates to autism and some of the complications. So we'll hopefully have a link to that in this presentation too.
Yeah.
Because it was a fascinating interview. But there's another presenter who's going to be at the Weston Price Foundation. I'm sure you're familiar with her, Dr. Natasha Campbell-McBride.
Oh yes, I heard her give a whole day seminar.
I mean, she really opened up my eyes. You know that. Yes, the aluminum may be an issue, but it may only be an issue if you have this predisposing condition, which has to do with the whole gut flora. So it's that combination that really
and in fact,
predisposes things.
So I've been studying the effect of sulfate in the gut because it's clear autistic kids have issues with their digestive system, and they have the leaky gut problem, they have the peptides, they get the opioids in the brain and all of that. And sulfate is necessary. It catalyzes the synthesis of enzymes that break down the gluten and the casein. So when there's not enough sulfate, those enzymes are not working properly, the gluten and the casein don't get properly broken down, the peptides end up undigested, and then the gut is leaky for the same reason that the skin is leaky, because there isn't enough sulfate. The peptides get into the blood, they make their way, they get past the blood-brain barrier for the same reason. In other words, all the barriers are deficient with the inadequate cholesterol sulfate. And the peptides get into the brain and they cause this opioid effect, like morphine, in the brain of the autistic child and of anybody who's got this kind of leaky gut problem, which is like a huge number of people in this country. I mean, there's huge issues with the digestive system right now, with the Crohn's disease and the irritable bowel syndrome and GERD, you know, the esophageal reflux disease and all that stuff. I think all of them are potentially related to the sulfur deficiency problem. So I sort of think it's like the explanation of everything, you know?
Sure, yeah, it's definitely a crucial component. And one of the other elements you mentioned is detoxification, and one of the central molecules of detoxification is glutathione, and it's really dependent upon cysteine, which is a sulfur-bearing amino acid.
Right.
And my understanding is that whey protein from raw milk would be one of the highest concentrations of that cysteine. So it's a really important precursor for glutathione, because many people can take supplemental glutathione, which has intrinsic problems for absorption and stability, and it's very expensive, it can be. But so to me, it seems the best way to improve your glutathione levels, is probably one of the more important molecules for detoxing.
Absolutely.
Would be through this mechanism. I wonder if you can comment on that.
I totally agree with that. I think that's a very good comment, and I completely agree. Yeah, glutathione is really, really important. It's a small molecule, it's got the sulfur, and it's very, very important as an antioxidant. And I think it gets depleted when you've got the sulfur depletion, and that may be a crucial part of the problem why you get all this oxidative damage.
So you think even if you have a total overall sulfur deficiency, which is sort of independent of the sulfur-bearing amino acids, that it'll seek to extract that, or it'll somehow impair the production of glutathione?
I think glutathione will get depleted just like the collagen. I think,
in fact,
even
it's going to suck the sulfur from the glutathione.
It's sucking sulfur from wherever it can find it. I
sense.
suspect even multiple sclerosis could be a consequence of sucking sulfur from the myelin sheath. You know, wherever the body, your particular genetic makeup decides is the right place to steal the sulfur, that's the kind of condition you're going to have as a consequence of your sulfur deficiency. So it could be a variety of different things.
Have you done any analysis, sort of epidemiological reviews in these areas that you mentioned earlier, such as in Oregon and the Cascade Mountains and in Crete in Greece, where you've looked at some of these diseases like multiple sclerosis or other conditions which seem to be dependent on? Have you noticed any changes there?
The only thing I can say about multiple sclerosis that's quite interesting, I had an email correspondence with somebody, and I don't remember his name. He's doing a study on a group of people who have multiple sclerosis, and he discovered by interviewing them that every one of them was not breastfed. And I think that that could very well be related, that they didn't get the proper sulfur in the early days of their, in the early months of their life, because they weren't breastfed. Other than that, I don't know anything else. I know multiple sclerosis is related to vitamin D deficiency. Vitamin D definitely helps it, and I suspect that does mean,
well, but
again, sulfur.
The refinement and understanding may actually be more properly or specifically sunlight exposure on,
I think so.
on exposed skin.
Vitamin D as a proxy
right.
for cholesterol sulfate. That's what I think. I think a lot of the things that, and there have been a lot of confusing experiments with vitamin D where they've had sort of failures, and they sort of, they think vitamin D should help this because they see that those people who have have this advantage, and they feed them vitamin D and it doesn't do a damn thing, for them. And it's because they're not getting the vitamin D sulfate and they're not getting the cholesterol sulfate. That's what you really need for the...
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I haven't taken oral vitamin D in well over a year, yet my vitamin D levels are sort of super normal. They're close to 80 or 100 or
so you get a lot of sun.
Over 100 when it, yeah. Well, I seek to get an hour to 2 hours a day if I can, depending on the weather, of course. But I really think it's, and I do my work outside. It's not like, it just seems that's what we're designed to do. So it's in my view, it's sort of crazy not to reproduce the optimum.
This is great because I find I'm always struggling to get enough sun, of course, especially in the winter.
Yeah.
I live in Boston, and at work I take an hour out of my day. If it's a sunny day, I take a walk outside.
Yeah.
But it's winter, so it's
well,
very, very
even
hard.
if you walked outside in the winter and it was a sunny day, and
you're all
the
covered
temperature
up.
was 70 degrees, which can happen in January. It's not common, but it can. Because of the
low angle.
the angle
yeah,
of the,
and your skin's all covered
you're not going
up.
to get there's not a significant enough
Yeah.
UV penetration to generate any vitamin D.
And that's where maybe the tanning room would be the answer. I actually make a special effort to go to a sunny place a couple of times in the winter, but not everybody can afford to do that.
Yeah, it's definitely a sort of ideal because at least for those of us who live in the United States, I mean, there's really only southern Florida is about it. I mean, even California's a little bit too cold.
And children today, not only are they discouraged, I mean, it's frustrating how religiously we're taught to cover them with sunscreen every time they go outside. It's just very, very shocking to me that the medical experts are telling them to do this. They're finally, I think, beginning to realize that there's an amazing vitamin D deficiency, but then they think, my sister had a vitamin D deficiency diagnosis. She lives in Idaho and doesn't get much sun, and the doctor says, stay out of the sun and take this, really 10,000 units vitamin D supplement pill. But their message seems to be the sun is really bad for you. And the fact is that the use of sunscreen has gone up by 30-fold since like 1970. And the incidence of melanoma, skin melanoma, has been steadily rising over that entire period by 3% every year. And so it's not actually working.
Well, part of the problem, as I understood it, is that almost all of the original sunscreens filtered out UVB, which causes the specific portion of the spectrum that causes our body to make vitamin D.
Exactly.
It filtered that out. And it didn't filter out UVA, which is what causes the cancer.
Yeah, it only
so it's actually increasing it. Now there's some, not all, there's still a number of sunscreens who do that. It's totally backwards. But a number of them caught on, and now they filter out UVA and UVB.
But they also have aluminum.
Oh, that's a good point. I didn't know that. And they have other things like oxymethoxybenzoate or OMC.
Chemicals. I mean, I basically don't like to put chemicals on
there are
my
some
skin.
safe sunscreen, and there are indications to use that. Because the sun can be a problem. I mean, not many of us are going to be climbing Mount Everest, but if you're climbing Mount
I
Everest,
ran into trouble just a week ago. You may notice I have a little. I thought I had plenty of tan base, and I went hiking, 10-mile hike up in the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho. Bright sunny day, and it was too much, and I felt
and that's
really,
probably what, 10,000 feet? Did you get 12,000?
Yeah, it's up high, and it's just like there's that unfiltered, high air sun. It's
but
just
even if you
really
go
vicious.
higher, like 20,000 feet or so, I mean, you take your goggles out, and you will be blind. You will absolutely be blind because there's no protection up there. So there are appropriate indications to use your sunscreen. Just overall, it's probably not wise in general. For certainly the indications that we're using now. We've been very excited about a new antioxidant that we've learned about last year, and that's astaxanthin. It's an extract from marine algae, and it's a very potent antioxidant, hundreds of times more potent than vitamin E, and it's actually what turns pink flamingos pink. But the marine algae produce it primarily as a mechanism, as a defense mechanism against the sun, so it provides them this protection against ultraviolet radiation. And the benefits in humans appear to be that it provides an incredible level of protection against sunburn or ultraviolet radiation damage. So I've just found that incredible. And when in our previous discussions, we were talking about the influence of sulfur performing a very similar role. And it seems to me there's a potential for an enormous synergy between the two. So I'm wondering if you could comment on the use of sulfur in helping protect us against ultraviolet-induced damage.
Yeah, sulfur is an excellent protection against UV rays, and in fact, I have a section of that in a paper that I published in the Weston Price Journal, Weston Price Foundation's journal. There's a box about specifically that sulfur protects from UV radiation and radiation damage in general. And so I agree with you. I think it would be great to combine those two into a very powerful protection. And I think that lack of sulfur may be a major contributor to issues regarding skin cancer. So if there's enough sulfur, and also of course the tan that you develop. I mean, I've always felt that if you develop a tan slowly in the spring when the sun is not so harsh, then you're ready for the summer sun and you're protected from the summer sun. Whereas if you wear sunscreen all the time, then the first time you forget to wear the sunscreen, you are very vulnerable to damage from the sun because you don't have the summer sun.
Could you comment on the connection between sulfur and skin cancer? Or expand on the
Yeah, well, I think because skin cancer would be caused by the damage that would be introduced by the UV radiation.
Okay.
And in a way, it might be that the sulfur is protecting because it's actually using the UV, it's using the light to good form to produce the sulfate molecule. And it might be that that's part of its protective
I guess another role that sulfur forms is literally allows us to become a capacitor, or essentially a battery, so that when we're exposed to the sun and we're not wearing a long sleeve shirt and we have shorts on, so that we can have the ultraviolet rays right on our skin, because the clothes essentially block most of it. And there's not enough surface area in our hands and our face. And we don't really want a lot of sun exposure on our face anyway, because it's going to accelerate photoaging, and we have such large surface areas otherwise, we don't need to use our face. So, although unfortunately and sadly, most people, that's what the only part that they're relying on. So could you comment on how sulfur is used by our body to allow us to essentially function as a battery, so we can suck up the energy from the sun, because there's plenty of energy there, obviously. So how does it essentially allow us to be some type of solar cell?
Yes, I mean, I've developed a theory that and I've developed it by reading a lot of the literature on the skin, on the production of cholesterol sulfate, and on the different molecules, the different cells that produce cholesterol sulfate, and then looking in parallel to see, to try to understand how they produce the sulfate. And I couldn't find anything in the literature that described how they actually synthesize the sulfate. But I did find that these same molecules all contain a molecule called, these same cells all contain a molecule called enos, endothelial nitric oxide synthase, which I believe is actually misnamed, that it is actually mainly, it's a sulfate synthesizer, and it only synthesizes nitric oxide under pathological conditions.
Interesting. How do you think that the bulk of the researchers who were involved in developing that and actually labeling it and doing studies with it missed the sulfur component?
I don't know, because there's evidence that's pretty clear that something's fishy about it, because you can find that red blood cells have substantial amounts of enos around, just on the interior of their cell membrane, and they cannot produce nitric oxide because it would be very toxic to them. They would bind, the nitric oxide would bind to the hemoglobin and act like carbon monoxide to prevent the oxygen transport. So they're puzzled. Why do these red blood cells have this enzyme in them? And then you see also the platelets and the mast cells, also major producers of sulfate, also contain enos, and the endothelial cells that line the artery walls that's the name, endothelial nitric oxide synthase. Those are the main cells where they first found it, and those cells are situated in the arteries that are close to the skin, or the veins. They're prepared to pick up the sun and do the transformation, grabbing the oxygen and the sulfur from the air and making sulfate, and also forming energy, packing energy into that sulfate molecule that has been extracted from the sunlight. So that's basically a solar panel effect that the skin has in absorbing the sun. Now, this is, of course, a theory of mine.
Sure, and as is a theory, you don't have any specific raw data at this point. So I'm wondering if you have any gut feelings as percentage-wise as to, because obviously this could be one way that we get sulfur. We actually sort of passively diffuse it, essentially. Well, it's not passive because there's an active component, but it diffuses through the skin into our system. So obviously we can get it through our food, and animal-based proteins are a really good source of that, and seafood. But percentage-wise, how important a contributor is that? Is it a small percentage? Is it?
I wish I knew.
So
I would love to
don't
know.
Okay.
I sort of yo-yo back and forth, and I don't even know for sure that it can actually pull the sulfur out of the air.
It's just a theory.
It feels like it should be able to do that, you know, and the oxygen
and
as
there's logical support that suggests that it's not just producing nitric oxide.
Yes.
Because and I think when we had discussed earlier, with respect to electron storage in the body, the sulfur-based storages are the primary storage, and then the secondary, once that fails, because the body always likes backups, once it fails, it fails to the nitrogen.
Transitions to nitrate. This is, again, a theory of mine.
Yeah.
And then transitions to carbon once nitrogen fails as well. Once you've got nitrogen failing, you're going to be, well, in the process of trying to get the nitrogen, once you no longer have the sulfur, you're going to basically take it from your muscles, and you're going to end up with these muscle wasting diseases.
Because we can deplete all our sulfur, not all, but most of our sulfur resources. But if you deplete
painful.
your nitrogen, you'd be dead because that's your muscles.
Yeah, you basically depleting all of them is painful. Depleting the sulfur gives you things like arthritis and potentially things like multiple sclerosis and Alzheimer's, and depleting the nitrogen gives you this muscle wasting problem where you become crippled. And then once you're down to carbon, you start to end up with a situation where you're inviting cancers. I think that's where the only thing left to do to try to salvage a situation is to produce a tumor, which can actually help to pull the damaging carbohydrates, the sugars, out of the blood and convert them into lactate, and then the lactate can work to, the lactate is also negatively charged. So that's another, the cancer actually is an anaerobic machine that converts sugar into lactate. And that's partially also trying to solve the problem of the ion charge, to produce negative ions through the lactate, which is a -1 charge.
Sure. Now, one of the other components, I think you had mentioned earlier when we were talking about statins, is the connection with sulfur and Alzheimer's or dementia.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, in fact, people with Alzheimer's have sulfur deficiency in the brain. There's this sulfatide-ceramide ratio that they've measured. Sulfatide, of course, contains sulfur, and it's related to ceramides. They're sort of with and without sulfur. And Alzheimer's patients have a much lower ratio of sulfatide to ceramide than normal people, which suggests a sulfur deficiency. Now, what I think actually, so you know the flu shot contains aluminum, and older people are encouraged.
Flu sprays don't, but the shots do.
Yeah, and old people are encouraged to get their flu shot. Be sure to get your flu shot every year, and every year they get a flu shot. They're injecting aluminum straight into the blood. If you eat aluminum, 99% of it goes through the gut and doesn't absorb. If you inject it, 100% of it is going to go into the blood. And if you don't have enough sulfate to get rid of the aluminum is going to end up in the brain. And then aluminum sulfate, as I said, salts out proteins. So you're going to get precipitates of things like amyloid plaque because of the aluminum sulfate. So I think that the aluminum combined with the sulfur deficiency is a major contributor to Alzheimer's. And in fact, I would even say Alzheimer's and autism are the same disease. So I sort of had this idea that they were the same, and then I started searching the web, and I came across a web page. I was really delighted to see this. There's a woman called Jean Brohart, and she has this, I think she's the mother of an autistic child, and she has this web page where she did this whole chart of autism, schizophrenia, and Alzheimer's, and she showed how they have all similar features, and she was proposing that they were essentially the same disease at different ages. And I think that's a really neat theory, and I would even add ADHD, depression, manic depression, that all of these things which are occurring at different stages of life may every one of them have to do with a combination of cholesterol sulfate deficiency and too much aluminum exposure. It's a possibility that I find very interesting.
So if someone watching this video didn't understand the process before and now is enlightened and had perhaps received annual flu vaccines for the last 10 years and now is concerned about this and certainly didn't pay attention to sulfur components, by addressing the sulfur and increasing the intake as we discussed earlier, would that help reverse this, or once it's in the brain, is it too late?
So of course I don't know.
Okay.
It's hard to find out something like that, but I would guess, since sulfur can help you to expel the aluminum, the more sulfur you get, the more chance you will have to do that. But whether it sort of ends up in the brain and kind of gets locked in that part and can't get back out again, I'm not sure, you know?
So, like
scary.
anything in life, the best approach is prevention.
Yes,
so
absolutely the case.
And aluminum toxicity is a big issue, and I have not actually used antiperspirants for 3 decades or
Yes.
longer, which is to me insane, because the way that most antiperspirants work, the antiperspirants means stops the sweating.
I
They
know,
they
with
work
aluminum.
through aluminum salts.
It's
So
terrible.
it's probably one of the, would you
I haven't
guess one of the
used-
higher sources of aluminum exposure that people are
I would
using?
imagine so. I would imagine that it's getting in, and especially if you don't have enough cholesterol sulfate, because then your barrier is not as good. And I also have never used deodorants. I just basically refuse. And because
Well,
of
there
the
may be some
toxicity.
benefit to deodorants. Deodorants don't have the aluminum,
The aluminum, yes.
but the antiperspirants do. And
Antiperspirants,
there's just,
right.
in my view, there's just no indication to ever use those. They're toxic, and they can
Yes.
only cause harm.
Yes,
So
I completely agree.
so then if you're going, for whatever reason you disagree with that or you don't believe it, at least get enough sulfur so you can help prevent this, because it's so much easier to prevent the problem than to
Absolutely.
solve it.
Yeah.
But aluminum has been notoriously difficult, at least in my memory, to detoxify.
I think
and I've never
likely.
really heard of the association with the benefit of sulfur in aiding that detoxification.
And I think
but
that
makes
it
sense.
takes time. It sort of stays in the blood and gradually works its way into the brain, gets past the blood-brain barrier, but it may not be able to come back out. It may get trapped inside the brain, because I think Alzheimer's is probably very, very hard to treat once you have it.
Yeah.
Which is very discouraging to think about, because then it's, of course, on the rise, and it's very scary to think about what
Yes,
we're
and it's
facing.
unfortunately one of those epidemics. So we have heart disease and diabetes, obesity, and Alzheimer's.
Yeah, they all, I think, are related to the sulfur deficiency problem.
Yeah, and our dietary components: sunlight deficiency,
Yes.
electron deficiency. One of the areas where we're starting to really understand more and teach more is about the just connections with the earth, where you're walking barefoot
Yes.
and grounding,
Oh, I know
which
what
is a
you're gonna
massive
refer
source of
to.
electrons. So I'm glad you're familiar with that. It seems to me, from what you've been describing, that the sulfur would be an important component too,
Yeah.
because ultimately this electron transfer has to be stored somewhere.
Right.
And is it the sulfur capacity that allows it to sort of form this battery that we can store that charge?
I think that's exactly very, very well said. And in fact, I know you had Gerald Pollack on your show, and I really enjoyed watching his video, and also the video his lecture. I think his lecture was fantastic. I watched where he discussed all this thing about water and these negatively charged particles, and how they build these exclusion zones, and how, and I don't know if you remember, but if you shine light, in the infrared light in particular, on these particles, then the exclusion zone grows by 4 times. And so I think that there's a complete analogy in the blood, because the blood is the water, and then you have these negatively charged particles are the cells, like the red blood cells and the white blood cells and the platelets, and all of those are negatively charged particles in the blood, and they have an exclusion zone around them, according to Pollack's theory. And that exclusion zone is going to exclude bacteria and viruses. And if they don't have enough negative charge, that exclusion zone is going to be smaller. And if they don't have enough infrared light exposure, that exclusion zone is going to be smaller. And that's going to allow the bacteria and the viruses to invade. And not just the blood, the cells in the blood, but also the endothelial lining of the blood and getting out into the tissues. So you really have a much, much worse problem with microbe infection if you don't have enough sulfate in your blood.
So sulfate, again, is the primary or the chief or one of the central areas where they store these negative charges.
I believe that.
Okay.
Well, there's also COO minus carbonate.
Okay.
These extracellular matrix proteins have these negatively charged things. But I think the sulfate is the key one that keeps you healthy, and the carbonate is kind of a backup system. I actually have a whole theory I'm working on of a cascade, sort of ways to manage oxygen transport, and I think of sulfate as an oxygen transport management system, because it has SO4. There's 4 oxygens in there. And nitrate is another example, NO3 minus 2. So that's got oxygen. So I think that there's a cascade in life as you first lose ground on sulfate, then lose ground on nitrate, and they're finally stuck with carbonate as the oxygen transport system. And once you're down to carbonate, you're in really big trouble. You're basically going to be facing cancer or AIDS or, various autoimmune diseases and cachexia, this sort of muscle wasting diseases. I mean, you're basically at the point where you can't even eat anymore because everything is toxic to your health, because your blood is so sick in terms of this lack of these mechanisms of oxygen transport that you can't utilize fuel because you can't transport oxygen. And
So
you become really, your mitochondria become really in trouble.
So the sulfur portion is the pinnacle.
I think so. I think that's the
top.
one you want to keep as long as you can in your life. You want to keep that one going. And the way you do that, of course, is the ways we've described.
Now, my guess is, one of my questions was how, since there really isn't a good test for cholesterol sulfate or any other real marker blood test for sulfur.
There is a blood test, because occasionally I've seen reports of cholesterol sulfate levels, but I don't know who does it, and I don't.
Oh, you mean cholesterol sulfate?
There's an ability to measure it, because I've read articles in which they report cholesterol sulfate.
But it's not available commercially.
It's not done routinely.
It's more of a research tool.
Yeah, a research tool. There's something exists that is a research tool.
Right, so it's not a commercial test. So the average person is not going to be able to do that.
Yeah. And the same for vitamin D sulfate too, I think. I think people just measure vitamin D. They don't specifically measure
well,
sulfate.
there's three. They can measure vitamin. They don't measure vitamin D. They measure 25-hydroxy-D or 25-dihydroxy-D.
Yes, right.
So those are the two that are measured. And the dihydroxy really doesn't need to be. It's very rare where that's ever beneficial. And it's a lot more expensive. But there's really no commercially available assay for sulfate. So the question becomes, at what point, I think, there really are the deficiency syndromes would probably be the symptoms of the diseases that we've just discussed, and it doesn't make any sense. So since there's no downside from your perspective. I mean, I guess if you ate pure sulfur, the chemical will be a potential problem. But if you're getting a food-based source, it's just you can't overdose on this stuff.
That's what I feel.
And more likely, probably the same thing for magnesium sulfate in the water.
I think so.
Because your body's going to not absorb it if it's overloaded, most likely. And so it makes sense just to make sure you have enough.
Exactly.
So the question is out. You haven't used it. You haven't had the opportunity to review the literature on the sulfur with respect to supplements like MSM.
MSM, yes.
We'll look into that and see if we
I
can,
would be very interested to see what you find, because you could
compile some analysis as to what the thought is on that. But I really appreciate your wisdom that you've shared. I mean, it's unusual to find someone who's got the scientific training and background, as you obviously do, and then really has the opportunity to just delve into the literature and review it and put it all together, because this is a giant puzzle. The information is out there. There's so many researchers. That's one of the reasons why I started this site, because I've recognized for a long time that there's these incredible individuals, and Pollock, you mentioned, is an example of one guy who's done this, where they've just committed their entire life to really understanding this one small area, but no one's really giving them a voice, and no one's really putting the whole picture together.
Right. I think there's too much specialization, because it really is amazing. I think if the left hand were talking to the right hand, they would have figured out the same thing I'm figuring out. But everyone's specialized, and so they become expertise in this one small area, and they're not able to generalize it across all the different other things that are happening. And but if you look, I'm happy to read anything about anything with regard to biology and metabolism and cancer and heart disease and whatever, and I'm just soaking up the knowledge. And every paper I read, I try to fit it in,
Well, that's what I try to do too, because my training is as a family physician, and that's sort of a generalist, where we take rotations in all the different subspecialties, and we seek to provide a comprehensive, integrated approach to the patient. Someone's got to be the captain of the ship and help them understand what it is, and that's really, I perceive, the role that we're doing here, is finding these spectacular pearls of wisdom that the researchers are coming together, putting it all together and presenting it in a practical way that people can utilize to prevent disease and improve their health.
Absolutely, yes, and I'm in great admiration of those people who are writing those articles that are the technical articles explaining what's going on in the biology, and those are the ones I really like.
Well, we greatly are appreciative of your efforts, because we need that connector, and you're that connector to take the research, synthesize it, and provide us with practical information that we can use.
Thank you.
Because it's all part of the team.
Right.
So are there any other areas that you'd like to comment on with the sulfur, or things that we may have overlooked?
Or the vaccines, perhaps, because I just read an article by Mark Blaxall. Do you know Mark Blaxall?
I don't believe so.
He heads the website called Age of Autism. And he wrote, and I just recently, yesterday, finished reading this long article. It's a 3-part article that he wrote about Gardasil, the vaccine Gardasil. Don't know if you've followed that.
Oh, sure. Well,
Yeah, okay.
we're quite familiar with Gardasil.
Yeah, because that
It's one of the worst ones out there.
Right, first
And
of all.
and it's getting worse because they're increasing the indications for it.
Yes.
And the number of, they're actually giving it to boys now.
It's a very scary story. I was deeply disturbed by it. It corroborates what I was suspecting, but in spades. You know, it's sort of like it's much worse than I realized it was. And Gardasil is the research was done in NIH, which makes it quite unusual. And there's this whole idea emerging of the government working with industry. And in fact, it's sort of in my field as well, right? Sort of government doing research, industry doing research, government being able to throw the research over the fence at the industry, who can then sort of productize it and market it, you know. But then the NIH researchers get money. They get, because they're the inventors. So they're making a lot of money off of the product that's being sold by the company, Merck, it turns out, in the case of Gardasil. And then the FDA has to be approving the drug, but the vaccine. But the FDA is part of the government, and they've got their buddies over there. I mean, the whole thing is extremely incestuous, it seems like. And the FDA just sort of, you know, runs through the approval very quickly. And
well,
Gardasil's,
they have these experts that are appointed, you know, basically primarily through the industry. They have phenomenal conflict of interest, and you have this small panel of experts.
Yeah.
Who actually are in charge of making this panel, who makes the recommendations. And essentially, once that recommendation is made, it's rapidly adopted by the federal health authorities and essentially becomes law because almost all the state public health authorities require it and mandate it as part of the process to enter the education system.
right, and of course,
or any health institution,
yeah,
too.
the story then ends up involving Rick Perry, the governor of Texas, who very quickly, soon after the FDA approved the vaccine,
Mandated.
He mandated it for the kids and for the girls in Texas, and so then all these kids are getting this vaccine, and it's incredibly. I've looked at it, you know, like the same thing I've done with everything else, Gardasil, not Gardasil, for the same age group, and it's amazing. I mean, it is much worse. It has the same problems that aluminum has, only much worse. So it must be very high aluminum content. And the thing that really disturbs me, and he talks about this in the article. I had not imagined this would be the case. When they study the drug, when they do the trials, the placebo is not a placebo. It only has to not contain the active ingredient. And the placebo actually contains the aluminum.
Right.
They put the aluminum in the placebo. I cannot believe they can get by with that.
Yeah, that's the standard of research.
It's so incredible. So then the placebo
has
has
they show no differences.
Yeah, I
because
mean,
they didn't exclude the
got
toxin.
the toxicity in
Right.
there already, and therefore they say, well, it's only a little bit worse than the placebo. But look at the placebo is terrible. And so Blaxell went through the exercise of showing that the placebo itself is toxic. And I'm just stunned, you know. And then, and of course, Rick Perry's all got ties into the Merck. I mean, everything is all tentacles everywhere. And this machinery is in place. And pretty soon, I think all the states are going to be like, mandating that these girls get this ridiculous vaccine, which doesn't really make any sense, even if it works, in my opinion. You know, it makes very little sense. It's supposed to protect against cervical cancer, and it's like a anti-cancer vaccine, which has kind of a nice buzzword to it. But I suspect it would wear off even before they would actually need it anyway, because they're getting 11 or 12 years old, you know, and And then I just can't imagine the consequences in terms of depression. I mean, depression is a very strong reaction.
I believe the new recommendation is to decrease or lower the age at which it's being given.
I know that. Well, they've started, introducing it in 9-year-olds. I don't understand.
Might even be part of the infant recommendation schedule. So, it's one of our initiatives. We have 4 primary ones, actually rapidly going into 5. But one of them is from our health liberty perspective, is to make sure that we maintain the freedom of choice, so that individuals can do their own independent research, objectively determine whether or not the risk outweigh the benefits for any specific vaccine, and have the ability to make the choice whether that's right or not for them, rather than having their child taken away from them for refusing to give a vaccine that they perceive as dangerous.
And in a country that prides itself on offering freedom,
yes,
and we don't give ourselves freedom of choice there, I believe that the vaccines ought to be 100% made optional. That the government might strongly recommend and might show you why they think this is a good idea, but the individual choice is up to the parent in all cases, and that your parent should always be able to opt out on the vaccines. And I find it annoying that they think, you know, the child who's not getting the vaccine is the one that's at risk, right? All those people who got the vaccine, why are they worried? They're protected, you know? I mean, I don't understand why they get upset with people for not.
Well, one of their justifications is that if that number of unvaccinated increases, that's going to potentially increase the risk for the disease spreading.
But it's only going to spread through the people who aren't vaccinated. So the people who supposedly, if the vaccine is working now, of course, I don't really think the vaccine works.
Yeah, that's all questionable and speculative. And then when these epidemics or many outbreaks do occur, you know, from my understanding review, there's really no difference, or even a higher percentage of the vaccinated who actually get to come down with the disease.
I know. Plenty of the vaccinated kids are not really protected.
Yeah.
And so they're kind of, I mean, they're in a hard place because they have to put in all this awful stuff, the adjuvants, in order to get the healthy kids to react. But the unhealthy kids, the kids who have a weak immune system, can be killed by it. I mean, the vaccine can kill them. I just think, like sudden infant death syndrome, that occurs, you know, much higher probability, like 3 or 4 days after certain vaccines. I've seen papers about that. And there's also, I think, all the food allergies. This is another area that I've gotten into with the vaccines. And I started, so I got tipped off on the peanut allergy and the egg allergy. Of course, the vaccines are often grown in egg, and so you end up with some egg in the vaccine itself. But they even put peanut oil into the vaccine, again, as an adjuvant, because it's something you can react to. And what happens is that you get this vaccine, and it's a strange, to you it looks like a very strange animal that's got some peanut oil, and it's got some aluminum, and it's got some toxin of some sort, like pertussis, you know. It's like a really weird animal. And your body's reacting to that whole package. And it thinks the peanut oil is part of the problem, and it's something it can react to. So your body becomes confused and thinks peanut oil is pertussin or something like that, you know? And then you get this very strong allergy to peanut oil. So I started exploring. So I got peanut oil and eggs, and then I started looking at the vaccine ingredients and everything that looked like it was a food. You know, you had like gelatin and soy. I mean, there's all kinds of things in the vaccines. They have, it's nice, you can find all the ingredients on the web. And every one of them, then I would do a search for allergies. And every one of them, I was finding allergies. And then I came across this web page, of course, you know, this woman, another woman, who has a web page where she's done a nice job of showing that she was able to identify a vaccine associated with every single food allergy she could find, except for one, something in Japan that was probably in Japanese somewhere, and she couldn't find it. But I mean, very, very strong, I think, compelling argument that vaccines may be the key contributor to this huge increase we've seen in food allergies in the last decade. And it's really become a serious problem. Now, 1 or 2% of the population has peanut allergy, 1 or 2% have egg allergy. I mean, and some of these allergies are so potent, they can just die from handling peanuts, you know?
But it's probably in conjunction with the other variables we mentioned earlier, which is the sulfur deficiency in combination with the gut flora being messed up. So you combine those, and you add this toxic vaccine to the mixture, and you have a prescription for trouble.
Yeah, it's just, you know, really scary. So not encouraging, I think.
No. But fortunately, you know, if individuals have the information, the knowledge, they can make proactive choices and prevent these.
Yes.
Because this is not necessarily rocket science. We tend to find out this information long before it's well accepted and adopted by the conventional community. So if you do your homework, you can be armed with the proper tools to protect yourself and your family.
That's true, and in fact, it's very nice that it's not very costly even. I mean, certainly going out in the sun is free, you know? So I think that if people, grassroots, can learn to take care of themselves in the right way, we can really see a difference in the quality of people's health looking forward, you know? It just has to happen in a grassroots form, I think, because it doesn't look like, you know, the experts are catching on.
I would agree. Well, any other words, or?
Exhausting.
Yes,
it was quite a whirlwind tour.
Yeah, I think we've given them a lot of information. So I want to thank you again for flying to Chicago to
Thank you. I'm very delighted, very pleased that you invited me. And
helping us really share this really crucial information. It's so foundational, so important, and really not well understood or really presented in even the alternative natural medical literature. It's just not many people who understand this, and certainly conventionally. So Thank you for helping us get up to speed in this area and look more for integrating this into our health in the future so that we can continue to take control of our health.
Thank you, and I will continue, of course, to do my research. I'm very eager to understand more corners of the story, and it's just been a really wonderful experience. The research itself has been really fun, and I still have a lot more to learn myself.
I'm sure we all do. It's a journey.
So, definitely.
If we ever believe we've arrived, I think we have to kind of seriously deluding ourselves. So
yes,
thanks again.
Thanks so much for watching. Remember, hit the like and subscribe button so you can get more videos that can help you and your family take control of your health.